Welcome to the first in a series of events at the Danforth Center that we'll be hosting this semester on reverent irreverence, parody religion, and contemporary politics. We are delighted to have Professor Melissa M. Wilcox with us to share her work on the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. Her book, Queer Nuns, Religion, Activism, and Serious Parody, is the critical work for approaching the complicated intersections of performance, politics, and religion. It's the stage-setting book on the subject, so we're very appreciative that she was willing to travel from Southern California to St. Louis, especially this time of year. I will have more to say about Professor Wilcox's scholarship in a minute, but first, I wanted to offer a word of thanks to those who have helped organize and publicize this lecture. Deborah Kennard, the Assistant Director of the Center. And there you are. I thank you, Deborah. And Hannah Pierce, the Event Specialist for the Center. Thank you, Hannah. And I also wanted to offer warm thanks to my co-conspirator, Cody Musselman, one of our Danforth Center postdocs who helped imagine this series with me. So thank you, Cody. Second, I wanted to offer an advertisement for the series as a whole. We will be hosting a conversation with William Talon, better known as the Reverend Billy, and Savitri D., the director of the Stop Shopping Choir, on Tuesday, February 6th at 7 p.m. We'll also be screening a new documentary on Reverend Billy and the Reverend Billy Project called Earth Riot. That's just out. We'll screen it at 6:30. It's about 20 minutes long, so if you want to come early, you can see Earth Riot, and then at 7 o'clock, we will have that conversation with Bill Talon and Savitri D. There will also be two other events in the series, a panel discussion here on February 29th at 5 p.m. on pranksters, stand-ups, and fitness gurus, which will feature a group of scholars, Joshua Wright, Sama Chowdhury, and Cody, all of whom have works in progress on religion, parody, comedy, and contemporary politics. Finally, on April 16th, we will have a concluding lecture by Anthony Petro from Boston University entitled Playing Sacred, the Camp Aesthetics of Feminist and Queer Art. We have more information on all of those events on the center website, and we have handouts about all of them as well outside on our table. So we hope to see many of you at other sessions in this series. Professor Melissa Wilcox is the holder of the Holstein Family and Community Chair of Religious Studies at the University of California, Riverside, where she also serves as an affiliated faculty member in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies. Professor Wilcox received her PhD in Religious Studies from UC Santa Barbara in 2000 and her BS in Biological Sciences from Stanford University in 1993. Working at the intersections of queer and trans studies and religious studies, Professor Wilcox has become a leading voice in that interdisciplinary conversation. The author and editor of 7 books, from Coming Out in Christianity in 2003 through Queer Religiosities in 2020, she is also the founding co-editor of QTR, a journal of queer and transgender studies in religion, and an associate editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. I could go on for quite some time listing her books, journal articles, keynote addresses, international consultations. Like the houses of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, Professor Wilcox's scholarship has at this point a genuinely global reach. Instead of reciting that longer list of her achievements, I would like to be a little more specific about why Professor Wilcox's work on queer nuns makes her such an important scholar to hear from in a series on reverent irreverence. How serious the issues at stake are for all the winking playfulness of the sisters. The parody the sisters perform is filled with joyous possibility and campy exuberance, Wilcox reminds us. The sisters are having fun. The play of sexual and religious puns that abound in the order offer ample testimony to that. Sister Savior applause, Sister Heir apparent, or Sister polyamorous. Bingo night with the sisters is anything but boring. But the parody is serious too, Wilcox keeps showing us. The recurrent movement between reverence and irreverence, sincerity and satire, emulation and critique. Serious parody is an activist strategy, an art of dissent and subversion, a performance in which religion is both troubled and reclaimed. Wilcox makes vivid a world of blurred complexity. How Sister Chrissy Fiction of the Order of Benevolent Bliss is also an ordained UCC minister, or how Sister Petunia Incarnata, a former Franciscan seminarian, finally finds in the order a way to be consecrated to the heart of God, or how Sister Tristina T. Room, the son, grandson, and great-grandson of Methodist ministers, after years of hating the church, discovers a way to fulfill his own religious calling through being a nun for the queer community. The sisters are real nuns, Wilcox insists, but that profession of realness often only magnifies the offense their political and religious opponents register. That might not be surprising in the recent cases of Mike Pence and Marco Rubio. But even Dianne Feinstein, when mayor of San Francisco, accused the sisters of being engaged in sacrilege. When I see you, I see red, she told two of the founders of the order. It is one of so many charged and telling scenes from the book. No one has rendered more fully the seriousness, artfulness, and political intricacy of parody than Professor Wilcox in her extraordinary work of ethnography, Queer Nuns. It is an honor to welcome her to the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics and to Washington University in St. Louis, and to hear from her about dodging the sisters, why queer nuns keep going viral. Professor Wilcox.
Thank you so much, Professor Schmidt, for that introduction. I feel like we're done. We should just stop. And thank you all so much for being here. I, too, want to thank everyone at the Danforth Center for all of the work that they've put in, for the honor of the invitation, and to Hannah Pierce especially for all of the careful work organizing and arranging everything. Thank you all also for being here. I will say I love cold weather, but I do appreciate not having 30 below with wind chill. That was nice. And thanks especially to the members of the order who've shown up in face today. That's a great honor, and I'm delighted to have you here. I want to begin by starting my timer to make sure I don't run you too late. By talking about where this story comes from. Last May, many people who are not themselves, now I have to find the clicker. I have too many pockets. There we go. Last May, many people who are not themselves members of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence learned about this order for the very first time. Here, this is, for those of you who are baseball fans, this is Yoshinobu Yamamoto, the star pitcher who just signed with the Dodgers a couple of weeks ago. On May 1st of 2023, the LA Dodgers announced their guests for their 10th annual Pride Night, held in June every year. The Community Hero Award was to be awarded to the Los Angeles House of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. The Dodgers said, this is a quote, for their countless hours of community service, ministry, and outreach to those on the edges, in addition to promoting human rights and respect for diversity and spiritual enlightenment. 11 days later, Florida Senator, all the way across the country, Marco Rubio, wrote to Major League Baseball Commissioner Robert Manfred. And again, this is a quote from Rubio's letter. Recently, you stated that Major League Baseball needs to, quote, make decisions that are as inclusive and welcoming to everyone as possible and keep us as apolitical as possible, end quote. I write, I'm continuing with Rubio, I write to ask whether your league wants to be, quote, inclusive and welcoming to Christians, and if so, why you are allowing an MLB team to honor a group that mocks Christians through diabolical parodies of our faith. On the same day, Catholic League President Bill Donahue claimed that the sisters promote hate speech and compared them to blackface performers. 2 days later, the Dodgers rescinded the award publicly. And 2 days later, LA County Supervisor Lindsay Horvath announced her refusal to attend Pride Night. By the next day, May 18th, the organization LA Pride, the ACLU of Southern California, the Los Angeles LGBT Center, and a number of smaller organizations, including the chorus I sing with, had all announced their decision to boycott Dodgers Pride Night. On May 20th, Anaheim Mayor Ashley Aitken invited the Los Angeles Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence to attend the Anaheim Angels Pride Night instead. May 22nd, 5 days after revoking the award, the Dodgers apologized and they reinstituted their invitation to the sisters. 9 days later, May 31, former Vice President Mike Pence, in a tweet, called the sisters, this is again a quote, anti-Catholic bigots. And he said that instead of apologizing to the order, the Dodgers, again a quote, should be apologizing to Catholics across America. America's pastime should respect the faith of every American, but apparently not the sisters, no matter what. That interpolation was mine. On June 7th, the LA Sisters attended the Angels Pride Night and were greeted by protesters in the parking lot. On June 16th, they attended the Dodgers Pride Night, more protesters, security presence, big kerfluffle. So here's what's particularly interesting to me about this. There are 26 current fully professed members of the Los Angeles House of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. They're part of an international order with a few to several thousand members in its entire, not quite 50-year history. The LA Archdiocese alone claims well over 4.3 million Catholics. Globally, there are billions. Those numbers don't really add up. So why does a group of 26 members cause national uproar? Equally small, the sisters in the past have caused similar uproars. The sisters are capable of going viral before there was even social media to go viral on. So what is it about the sisters? This is Sister Unity Divine, one of the most prominent, as in one of the most well-known and longest-standing members of the Los Angeles House. Her name is both a religious statement and also a reference to the drag queen Divine. So, as I say, this is not the first time this has happened. This is a repeated pattern in the history of the sisters. Just to give a few representative examples, and these all involve the founding San Francisco house, in part because some of them are historical. I want you to see how far back this goes, and in part because this is where some of the best stories that I have come from. But these kinds of reactions are in no way limited to reactions to the San Francisco house. In August 1980, the very first press coverage of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence came from the gay press and was reporting on a context in which the sisters were trying to figure out how to deal with the fact that the Castro district, the gayborhood of San Francisco, was seeing a regular appearance of evangelical missionaries who were shaming the people that were walking by them, telling them that they should give up the sin of homosexuality and come to God, as though you can't do both. And really just making people feel awful about themselves. They were really unwelcome in the Castro. There were protesters. The protesters were really just sort of amping up the missionaries that were showing up. The sisters decided to take another approach. So they held a prayer vigil against the protesters. They sang songs that were written specifically to help encourage the protesters to see themselves in a different light. They prayed to be relieved of the sins of these particular homophobic protesters and relieved of their presence, and that got them coverage in the press. But what's really interesting about that coverage is the number of scare quotes. It's littered with scare quotes. Nuns, sisters, they held a vigil, they prayed, they had hymns. Everything is in scare quotes, like this isn't real. It looks to me, reading that article, that the reporter had no idea what he was looking at, had no idea what he was dealing with. This is not an uncommon response to the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. In October of 1980, there was a protest at the Catholic University of San Francisco. There was a gay rights group that had started at the law school, and USF quietly removed them from the law school catalog, basically erased them from existence. So there was a protest, and the sisters show up. That also gets them a lot of press. But there's a really funny story from one of the founding members of the order, Sister Missionary Position, now known as Sister So Am I, who, yes, there's lots of those names, who talks about, we went to the protest, and then when it was over, Cal Jader was playing on campus, and so I went to the concert, and a priest came and sat next to me, looked me up and down, and said, at least you're wearing the habit. This is shortly after Vatican II. A number of nuns' orders were very relieved to be able to not wear the habit anymore. So even back then, there are these interestingly complicated reactions from Catholics themselves to the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. In September of 1987, Pope John Paul II visited San Francisco, and the sisters took that opportunity to level protests against the official policies of the Vatican around safer sex, around condom distribution, and around same-sex desire. Not around gender variance, because it's only relatively recently that the Vatican has even started talking about that. So could we go ahead and play that news clip? This is introduced by a very young Connie Chung, who you won't see in the clip. This is Sister...
It was the first round in what they say will be a nonviolent war, a series of protests against the Pope called by the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, San Francisco's high camp activists, who today introduced their newest member, Pope Impious I.
This Pope from Rome is bringing to our city a message of prejudice and ignorance, a scourge that the enlightened have worked long and hard to diminish.
The sisters are sure to draw much attention from the worldwide media following the Pope as they protest everywhere he goes. Their sophisticated press release says plans include canonizing the late Supervisor Harvey Milk into sainthood. Meanwhile, inside St. Mary's Cathedral, Archdiocese officials were carrying out what has become a weekly series of papal trips toward AIDS comes too late for the sisters. They marched to the front of the cathedral to leave a letter asking the Archdiocese to cancel the Pope's visit. They taped their demand to the cathedral doors in the tradition of Martin Luther. Only in this case, the note was tacked up using Lee press-on nails, which the sisters are famous for.
In most parts of the world, the Pope travels without challenge or controversy. That will not be the case in San Francisco, and we got a taste of that today. In San Francisco, Hank Plant, Channel 5 Eyewitness News.
So that was Sister Vicious Power Hungry Bitch, originally Sister Adhanarishvara, and now known as Sister or Grandmother Vishnu, which is also an interesting turn. More things to say there, and I won't. what you can see, the picture on the left is also, you can see that same cross that says 2,000 years of oppression that you saw in the news clip. This is another protest that was held at the same time during that same visit that was actually a mass against papal bigotry. This is a fully designed mass. It has not been performed recently to my knowledge, but it had a full liturgy. It was designed by, at the time, Sister Mish, who was in seminary until he was asked to make a heterosexual adjustment, and then he could come back to seminary later on. He instead made a religious adjustment. So again, you see this kind of parody and protest going on, and yet at the same time, this is a very serious mass. It was a religious service, just sort of a, more fully inclusive religious service as far as the religion covered went. Of course, there are questions for us to talk about as well in terms of the politics of canonizing a Jewish man. They also distributed golden condoms instead of communion, or we could play with words and communion, but I'll leave it there. A more recent, equally interesting case where we see a lot of the same language around hate speech, hate crimes, hate group is a situation in October of 2007. So, and that's what this picture on the right is. The picture's not attributed. All the visual media that went around, at least at the time, about this situation was taken by conservative Catholics, and most of the videos that you can find about this case also are sort of overlain with really homophobic text and stuff. So I don't tend to show the videos, but the clip is useful. The image is useful. So this is at Most Holy Redeemer, which is the Catholic Church in the Castro in San Francisco. Two members of the order, one of the San Francisco House, one of whom is a practicing Catholic, the other of whom is spiritual and has the most strongest affinity, at least at the time that this happened, with Zen Buddhism, found out that at the time, new Archbishop, Archbishop Niederauer at the time of San Francisco, was going to be visiting Most Holy Redeemer for the first time. And both liberals and conservatives wanted to know what Niederauer would have to say to a pretty heavily gay congregation. So these two sisters attended in habit, and when the time came for Holy Communion, the sister who's Catholic, of course, went up, and the sister who is not comes more from a tradition that says you don't refuse hospitality, didn't know that it wouldn't be considered appropriate for her to take communion. So out of a sense of respect, even if a somewhat misplaced one, she also, that sister also went up and took communion. And as you can see, nothing really happened in some of the video that is available of this incident, of this not incident. You can see parishioners later thanking the sisters. You can actually, if you lip read, you can actually see one of the people saying, "Thank you for being here." They're really recognizing the sisters as members of the community, representatives of the community. The Archbishop doesn't blink. And at the same time, a conservative Catholic men's group from San Jose, which is Silicon Valley, essentially 45 minutes to an hour south of San Francisco, they also came. And they saw the sisters and were horrified, appalled, and pulled out their cell phones, recorded video, posted it, and again, it went viral. The news went around the world, and you had all kinds of language about fake nuns, drag nuns, people insulting the Catholic Church by coming to the service at all, and moreover, by actually taking communion. this too is a really interesting case because the same questions arise. Not only do you have more conservative commentary decrying the sisters and saying how this is anti-Catholic and again, using all of this hate language, but you also have progressives who are not Catholic themselves going, or who are former Catholics going, yes, the sisters are sticking it to the Catholic Church. But whether you're like, oh no, the sisters are sticking it to the Catholic Church, or yes, the sisters are sticking it to the Catholic Church, you're still assuming that the sisters are sticking it to the Catholic Church, which is not what they were doing. I've actually spoken to the sister who's pictured here, and that's not at all. That wasn't at all the intent. The intent was to support and represent the community in the context of an interaction with a Roman Catholic hierarchy that is often not friendly, and sort of trying to see what this new archbishop, how this new archbishop was going to be approaching the community. So let's back up a little bit. Who are the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence? This is an early postcard the sisters published to do some fundraising. The sisters are founded on Easter Saturday in 1979. But their roots, well, at least the habits, go back to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. That's a story that I love telling. Not everybody knows. I especially love telling it in the Midwest. There was two of the people shown here, both of the people more to the left, were at the University of Iowa in various capacities, were part of the Gay Liberation Front chapter at the University of Iowa, and one was also part of a local drag troupe. And the drag troupe decided that they were going to do a number with nun characters. So they went to a local convent, mentioned that they were doing a performance of The Sound of Music. I don't think they mentioned what kind of performance they were going to be doing. And the convent gave them 3 retired habits. Those retired habits, when the former member now of the drag troupe moved to San Francisco, came along. And one day, 3 friends were sitting around. They were bored. It did happen to be Easter Saturday, but from all anyone's told me, it wasn't because it was Easter Saturday. They just decided, hey, on a lark, let's put on these nuns' outfits and, go for a stroll and see what happens. So, and you've heard these names already, so I'll give you the names. You can also see them down here if you can see the screen. Bottom left is Sister So Am I, then known as Sister Mission, well, not then, they took names later, but who became Sister Missionary Position. Top left is Sister Vish, who started as Sister Aranarishvara, and then very quickly, fun story here too, but I don't have time to tell it, became Sister Vicious, power-hungry bitch. And then over to the right is Sister Resurrection, who did not remain, who didn't continue manifesting as a sister, but was one of the key, was a public health nurse and was one of the key authors of the Sisters' Safer Sex Guide, which was the very first sex-positive safer sex guide for gay men that was produced before AIDS was even named. Again, more stories there that I don't have time to tell. So Sister Vish recounts noticing the reactions that they got as they're walking down the street in these habits, and refers to them as psychological car wrecks. People are walking by, just sort of everything stops. What is this? And so they recognized, okay, we're tapping into something here. There's something going on. So they manifested again, got similar reactions. Okay. They decide to start putting on the habits more intentionally, and talked about what exactly this would mean. And another founder of the order, who at the time was called Sister Hysterectoria, said, so I'm from New Orleans, and at Mardi Gras, lots of people dress as nuns. It's not a really big thing. What would be really different as if we actually were nuns, and we served as nuns, and we took on nun names, and that's sort of where the initial seed gets planted. It's several months after that that they draw up the Constitution and Rules of Order, and they identify the mission of the order as, and this is still used today, there's a slightly different version of it in Australia and the other Commonwealth houses, but the mission of the promulgation of universal joy and the expiation of stigmatic guilt. So why perpetual indulgence? Remember, we've got founding members of the order who are highly trained in Roman Catholicism, not just grew up Catholic, but in the case of Sister Mish, went to seminary. They're not just thinking about the idea of self-indulgence, they're thinking about the concept of indulgences, which, again, have a bad rap these days because anybody who knows about the selling of indulgences is often thinking about sort of accusations of corruption against the Catholic Church and how wealthy people could sort of buy a get-out-of-sin-free card. But indulgences also were understood as a sort of plenary forgiveness, a way to sort of release you from your sins and allow you to start over. This is what a lot of contemporary Protestants claim is one of the key things about coming to Jesus, is that your slate gets wiped and you get to start over again. The sisters granting a perpetual indulgence say it's not just once, but we are working to free people from the senses of guilt and shame around their embodiment, around their identity, around their desires, around their practices, around who they are. So that perpetual indulgence, again, sounds like just parody, but there's something very, very deep there. As a matter of fact, in the list of sexually transmitted, I think they were using diseases at the time, the list of STIs, to update the language, in the original Safer Sex Guide, which is called Play Fair, one of the STIs that's listed is guilt. And there's a great write-up. Again, I don't have the direct quote, and I won't do it the dishonor of attempting to paraphrase, but essentially it says this is something that you get from popular culture, from TV, from religion, and it's something that you should be healed from, something that you should be getting rid of. Uh-oh, there we go. That one. I hope I didn't just shine to somebody. Sorry about that. Wrong button, not used to this clicker. The sisters, as Professor Schmidt said, understand themselves as nuns, as queer and trans nuns, as nuns for queer and trans communities, in smaller communities as nuns for everyone, for the whole community, and often as nuns serving in an area where nuns of other traditions, Catholic, but also Buddhist, Jain, Episcopal, are not serving. They see themselves as engaging in the same kinds of caregiving, ministry, education, fundraising, community service, and social justice activism that many people associate nuns with, and particularly associate Roman Catholic nuns with. The sisters take vows for life. This is something else that people often don't know if they're not familiar with the order. It's a religiously unaffiliated order, but especially in the US, many members of the order, a few of whom are Catholic themselves, some of whom, as I've mentioned, are even former seminarians, many members consider their work with the order to be a part of their spiritual practice. There are also agnostics and atheists in the order. It's a whole range of religious backgrounds, a whole range of current religious affiliations and practices. What makes them different from other orders of nuns is that they're not a celibate order. Certainly there are individuals who may be practicing celibacy or who may be not voluntarily celibate. But the sisters point out that there are many kinds of nuns. I've already listed off a number of them. So the sisters are among them. They therefore push us to ask the question, how do we know what we think we know about what nuns are? I've had people argue with me that I can't call the sisters religious. I have to use another word for them. And I thought, that's kind of the argument that happened against same-sex marriage too, right? Well, you can't call it marriage. You can have it, but you can't call it that. You have to call it something else. That's actually where the Vatican just went. 20 years after the US started going there. No, 30 years after the US started going there. So when we're thinking then about the sisters, we also have to think about how we define religion, why we define it that way, how we define nuns, why we define them that way. If the sisters are nuns and they're not celibate, then there are orders of nuns that are not celibate, and we need to change our definition of nun. There are orders of nuns that are not, some of whose members are not assigned female at birth, some of whose members don't currently identify as female or as women. So we need to change our definition of nuns rather than just say, oh no, we know what nuns are, stop, full stop, end of sentence, and thereby exclude the sisters. One of the most important points that sisters often make, at least in my mind, about their relationship to other orders of nuns is that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. And I often say that, in my experience, one of the best ways, not that you want to do this because it messes their makeup up, but one of the best ways to make a sister cry is to tell her that a Roman Catholic nun sees her work, sees the work that they're doing as similar to the work that Catholic nuns do. Because the sisters, in many cases, are very critical of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, as are other members of the Roman Catholic Church, but they emulate the best of Roman Catholic nuns. I talk in the book, and Professor Schmidt raised this as well, about the concept of serious parity. So I want to just go back to this really briefly, because it took me a while working with and learning from the sisters to sort out how to talk about what I was seeing. Because on the one hand, there is, of course, this parodic element. You see Sister Vish going, oh, Martin Luther nailed his theses to the church, so I'm going to nail them too, but with a Lee press-on nail, right? You see, the parody is all over the place. It's in the names. It's in the fun, and the joy comes in part from the parody. And yet it is not just parody. When you can make a sister cry by saying, look, especially if somebody who is a Roman Catholic nun, right? I see the work you're doing. You're doing work that's similar to what we do. You're doing work that's just like the work that I do. I honor that in you. That's very serious. The sisters are very serious about their ministry, which is often life-saving. They're very serious about their community support. They're very serious about the fact that for those who do see a spiritual connection here, this is spiritual work. The sisters are serious, and they're funny, and they're joyful, and they're beautiful, and putting those two together seems to many people like a contradiction in terms. But it is exactly that meshing that I think that makes them so powerful. One more brief thing on that, and then I'll go on. One thing that I found talking with sisters who'd been members of the order for a few decades was the number of people who started out in ACT UP. This is the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, another performative activist group, very well known among people who study street activism and performative activism. They were known to have open casket funeral processions in order to bring literal visual awareness to people who were dying of complications of AIDS. One of their most prominent, or at least most talked about actions, was when they threw ashes of people who had died of complications of AIDS and been cremated onto the White House lawn, when you could get anywhere near the White House lawn. So in ACT UP, people were really able to channel the rage, that they felt at the silencing that was going on, everything from the federal government in the US, and the ACT UP became global, but begins in the United States. Everything from the federal government in the US to the silencing that was happening even in the sciences. There was no money for research. Really, very little was done about the AIDS pandemic for roughly the first, I mean, really almost as much as 10 years, certainly for the first 5 or 6. There's utter silence because it's affecting communities that the broader nation is marginalizing and many people would say is really not caring about. And people come from ACT UP to the sisters because several people told me they burned out on the rage. And they found the joy that the sisters brought to their activism to be much more sustainable than the rage. So this is also interesting to think about because rage is critical. Activism is a critical place to be expressing rage so that it doesn't eat you up, so that you can turn it into something that makes change. Rage is a powerful driver of activism. But pairing that with the joy, pairing that with the caring, that comes along with that joy and the parody and the laughter allows people to sort of lighten up and survive and thrive. So let's go back to our story about the Dodgers. Hate crimes, fake nuns, these signs say Dodgers sold their soul, men can't be nuns/sisters, stop disrespecting sisters, Sacred Heart of Jesus, have mercy on us, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they do. Is this just a misunderstanding? This is Sister Maya from the Portland house wearing the veil of shame. This is a ritual that some houses do on December 1st on International AIDS Awareness Day. Is this just a misunderstanding? Is it just because people don't understand who the sisters are? Back to our question, how does such a relative to the Catholic Church, how does such a small group get such a huge reaction time and again? I think the key lies not so much in a misunderstanding of the sisters, but in a refusal to accept that the sisters are emulating, not mocking. Why might people struggle to accept that the sisters are emulating nuns rather than mocking them? And again, I want to say, this misunderstanding, this refusal to accept, happens on both the right and the left. So whether you respond to it by gleefully saying, yes, they're mocking the church, or by being appalled and saying, oh, they're mocking the church, it's still that refusal to accept that the sisters might be emulating nuns. So to explain this, I want to step back a little bit into history, because this is directly related to the concept of the predatory invert from a century and a half ago. Our contemporary concepts of heterosexuality and homosexuality were invented in the middle of the 19th century by sexologists in Europe. And they tied, and this was not an entirely new move. Again, I always have to tell my students, I'm not saying that people weren't having sex before then, right? We know that. We're all here. And likewise, the tie between same-sex attraction and ideas of gender goes back earlier than the sexologists. They didn't invent this whole cloth. But what they did do is suggest that in every same-sex sexual interaction, first of all, there were only 2, which is not very creative of sexologists. And second of all, there essentially was still a man and a woman. So there was basically a quote-unquote normal who, if he was a man, and we're going to assume cisgender here for a minute, if he was a man, he was basically kinky. He had sort of extravagant sexual tastes. And if she was a woman, she had been seduced. She had been drawn into unsavory relationships. That in itself is interesting to think about, the differences between, either he's oversexed or she's been seduced. This is a time period when men were understood to be sexually uncontrollable and women were understood to be sexually frigid. The other person in the pairing was a quote-unquote invert. In other words, someone who was at their core, today we would say trans. So the sexologists were essentially maintaining compulsory heterosexuality. They were maintaining the idea that all sexual relationships, all sexual interactions took place between a man and a woman, even if the two bodies appeared to be women or the two bodies appeared to be men. And the person that was whose role, let's say, didn't match their embodiment or what was assumed about their embodiment, I have to talk about this carefully, was called at the time an invert. So essentially the concept of homosexuality as we have it today, that very medicalized concept, most people don't like that term these days, is intertwined in its creation with the concept of transness. And although you did have some sexologists say very clearly, there is nothing wrong with inversion. This is in the 19th century. There's nothing wrong with inversion. This is a normal part, a natural part of human variation. Others said, oh no, inverts are sick. And they very quickly came to be cast as predatory. So the stereotypes that we still have today about gay men being feminine and lesbians being masculine, those date back to sexology. Those date back to the invert. The ideas about same-sex desire being perverse or sick also date back to the invert, date back to the sexologists. When same-sex desire was depathologized, and mind you, this was in the 1970s, by the American Psychiatric Association, at the same time, transness becomes a disorder. Now, there are lots of ways we can think about that history, but when we're thinking about questions like the ones I'm pursuing here, we have to think about the ways in which pathology gets shifted from same-sex desire to gender variance. This is when same-sex desire and gender variance start to really get pushed apart. It's not entirely surprising that around this same time, you have the rise of what was sometimes called the Castro clone, a very hyper-masculine way of presenting one's gender that a lot of gay men, not just in the Castro, were pursuing at the time. There are a variety of scholars who've traced the history of this politically and how the trans rights movement starts to split off from the gay rights movement, but also how the gay rights movement, particularly the more mainstream assimilatory gay rights movement, was really kind of happy to have the trans rights movement split off because, again, it pulled this sort of threatening specter of the invert away from gayness and over into transness. Popular culture lags somewhat behind, but slowly the image of the predator, if you watch sort of horror films or action films or even some of the dramas that have a sexually predatory figure, it slowly shifts from being predominantly a gay man, very occasionally a lesbian, because, eventually women show up in these. It shifts from being a gay man to a gay man in drag to a trans woman. It's the same figure at the core, but who it's associated with in contemporary politics has changed. So underlying this fictional figure of the predatory, threatening invert is intertwined misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia, and they make this fictional figure fundamentally, irretrievably, and uncontrollably sexual. So it is always also a sexually predatory figure. This is why conversion therapy, starting with psychology experiments at top schools like UCLA in the 1960s, all the way through to conservative Christian therapists in the early aughts, and some of them still today, why they focused on changing gender roles in order to try to make people straight. If you think about it for a minute, that's a little weird. Okay, lesbians, you have to learn to cook and sew, and gay men, time to go change that oil in your car, and then you won't be gay anymore. This is about tying gender to sexual desire in how you conceptualize where same-sex desire comes from. Spoiler alert, doesn't work, none of it works, causes intense damage. We kill people's souls and kill people's bodies that way. And that's why it's been banned for decades by both APAs, psychiatric and psychological associations. This is also why trans people and drag performers are now targeted as adult topics and adult figures who are constitutionally, ontologically, in their very being, dangerous for children. All of the anti-drag laws, all of the transphobic laws that are coming out across the country and more broadly, but of course we see a lot of this in the US right now, is coming out of this language of the predatory invert. But the predatory invert is no longer a gay man or a lesbian woman. The predatory invert is now a trans person, and particularly a trans woman, in terms of how that fictional figure is cast. There's another piece here that I want to stop on briefly as we're getting a little close on time. And that has to do with the ways in which we have defined religion itself. So the concept of religion is socially constructed. This is the point at which a lot of my students go, yes, I always knew it, it's all fake. Not what I mean. But what we mean when we say religion has been shaped and invented really starting with Enlightenment philosophers. So when we say the word religion and we think we know what it means, we actually have to stop and think about, well, why do we think that that's what religion is? One of the interesting things about the history of how this developed is that religion and sex came to be divorced, except in certain highly orientalized contexts where you can kind of bring them back in together. But we have this sort of sneaking suspicion that sex and like real religion or proper religion don't actually go together. And as soon as you bring them together, then you've invalidated the realness. Yes, I'm using that word on purpose. You're invalidating the realness of the religion. So let's put all of these pieces together and follow the logic around the bases. If nuns actually means Catholic nuns, if Catholic nuns are celibate, if gender variance is by definition sexual, and if sex can't go together with real religion, then the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence must be fake Catholic nuns. Don't ever take a picture of this slide and put it up because I'm walking through someone else's logic, not mine. Then the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence must be fake Catholic nuns. The fakery must be parody. The parody must be sexual, and therefore the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence are mocking and sexualizing Catholic nuns. Those are all the pieces that go into this knee-jerk, this is a hate crime, this is offensive to Catholics reaction. And they should therefore no more be receiving awards than people who wear sexy nun costumes for Halloween. But unlike people who wear sexy nun costumes for Halloween, unless it's the sisters out, being monitors of your big Halloween gathering in the Castro, they're organized and they're promoting what they do as a public good. I think that this is the core of the outrage. So, final piece. Why the press got it wrong? Why did the press coverage fail? In the end, this is neither a sports story nor a culture wars story. And almost all of the press coverage about this story focused it in one way or another. It's either like, oh, this is a kerfluffle in Major League Baseball, so it's a sports story, and we're going to get our sports reporter to comment on it, and most of the sports reporters had no idea what they were looking at with the sisters. Or it's a culture wars conversation, and so we're going to bring in somebody to talk about conservatives and liberals and how conservatives hate liberals, and it doesn't really get you anywhere. Instead, I think this is a story about a centuries-old intertwining of misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and Western imperialism that denies, or better yet, disavows any relationship between religion and sex on the one hand, and on the other hand, that defines both queer people and trans people as ontologically, constitutionally, irreversibly sexual, and therefore makes all trans and queer religiosities completely illegible. So that is the story behind the story of the Dodgers and the Sisters, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So we have 25 minutes or so for questions. I am just going to moderate and help pick out people with the questions, and Professor Wilcox will work from there. Are we, okay, so we have microphones. So if you have a question, we will give you a microphone. All right here we have a question from Professor Griffith.
Thank you so much, Melissa. It was just absolutely fascinating and so much else. I was interested, you talked about, it's very compelling that when Catholic nuns themselves look at a sister from the order and say, I see you, I recognize what you're doing. I wondered what concrete examples there were. Simone Campbell jumped into my mind and these nuns on the bus, you know, these kinds of what we think of as really progressive nuns, but that might not be. I mean, has that happened? When has that happened? Who are the Catholics who are willing to really say, I see you, and you know, I care about what you're doing?
Yeah, thank you for your question. A lot of the stories that I've heard, I mean, the reason that I say it the way I do is that I've heard these stories repeatedly when I was doing the research for this book. And they're not like big prominent nun stories, although Sister Janine Gramick, the founder of New Ways Ministry, which is under the aegis of the Vatican LGBT ministry, she's on record multiple times as supporting the work of the sisters. But a lot of these are stories of like, you know, I was working a soup line at this church and there were nuns there as well, and one of them turned to me and said, or my sisters and I went out in habit to a restaurant after something that we'd manifested for, and the person sitting at the table next to us started asking us a lot of questions about who we were, and finally said, well, I'm also a nun. Yeah, it's those kinds of chance encounter stories that I heard regularly. Yeah.
Let's see, right here.
Hello, thank you for your wonderful presentation. It was amazing. My question is about the place of liberation theology and just other theologies that you've gotten to engage with. Like, how has that helped influence your writing and interpretation of, I guess, queer nuns in general? I really appreciate the use of your theological words so far, because it really calls into of like, this is a serious imitation and not just like, you know, like it's not just a game. It's not just for fun. Like, this is real work. And so with it being real work, I wonder how have you gotten to engage with other theologies as well?
Yeah, thank you. I think I would say, first of all, that I want to be sure to be clear, I'm not a theologian. So I'm trained primarily as a historian and an ethnographer. I like to say I'm half historian, half ethnographer, and half queer theorist. It adds up to more than one, queerly, on purpose. But certainly, when queer studies in religion was earlier in its history, you couldn't make divisions about like, well, I do this work over here, and the theologians are over here doing this work. We were all in conversation, and many of us still are. So in terms of my own work, because I'm interested in the spaces that trans and queer people make for themselves / ourselves within religion, sort of broadly defined or broadly construed, certainly liberation theology is something that I've read and that I've studied. I tell people I have an accidental seminary degree. I went to a program that was supposed to be more of a religious studies program and found out belatedly after I'd enrolled that the majority of almost all but like 1 or 2 of their core faculty were actually on the payroll of a Methodist seminary before the Methodists opened up. So I had a whole bunch of like closeted friends who were seminarians, and that was a very interesting experience. Wasn't what I thought I was getting into. But as a consequence, I got to take interesting classes on political theology and liberation theology and process theology, which that's like reading Derrida. But as far as the sisters themselves go, I want to say that they're in many ways sort of parallel tracks, but there's certainly overlap because there are sisters who are in ministry, there are sisters who are interested in theology, and so and certainly queer and trans theologies are heavily influenced, shaped, inspired by Latin American liberation theology, Black liberation theology, feminist theology, all of the theologies that sort of grew earlier out of that, out of the work of Gutierrez. Yeah, thank you.
Question here?
Thank you so much today. I'm kind of curious just because at times there can be like a firm contradiction within like conservative Catholicism and kind of like conservative religion at large, and I really enjoyed how you emphasized like the seriousness within becoming a part of the sisterhood and kind of the community impact of what they do, which is very powerful. So I was wondering in your research and investigation if you've talked to like the other side, for lack of a better word, and kind of what their resistance is based in and kind of how they're justifying being against being against an entity that seems to serve the same purpose as they do.
Yeah, good question. And no, I haven't. A big part of that is that my work is really trying to bring trans and queer voices to the fore and not give more airtime to homophobia and transphobia. I can't live with the haters in my head. More power to those who can, because that's also really, really important work, but it's not the work I do. And also, while I think it's really important to take people's own perspectives into account, I don't want to ever advocate for, arguing for interpretations of things that people would themselves disavow, I actually think there's something really complicated going on in terms of these, their immediate knee-jerk reactions, but they're so strong. If you know the sisters, and even just looking at the sisters, these questions started out because I was like, how do you look at the sisters and see hate? But then I thought, well, that's actually a really good question. That's interesting. But yeah, so I think to a certain extent, trying to pull that out would be, it's an interesting question. It's an absolutely valid question. And I think I'm not sure you would really get to what I think is the root of the issue.
I'm wondering. Anyway, I was in Latin America, lived and worked there for 4.5 years. After that, in 2013, I went with a delegation. 14 of us, LGBT, went down to be international observers. So we did an intense study. Just before we got there, there were just 2 people ever in the history of Honduras had come out and ran for an office. One was taken, tortured horrendously, left dead for everybody to find him, and the other one had to flee and come to the U.S. Have you ever looked at this relative outside the U.S.? It seemed like you were focusing on the U.S., but have you gone and looked at other cultures and kind of made a comparison or not?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question and for your work. The sisters are international. They're active on 4 continents. at least as of my last check, and I should say I'm working on a different research project now, so our sisters in the back may be able to update us a bit more. And there are strong similarities across, so they absolutely see themselves as, all part of the same order, but they're also, order is used in two different ways. There's the worldwide order, and then there are also, people talk about individual orders that are regional or that are language-based or that relate to where they were founded, like the Commonwealth Order or the German-speaking order. The differences have largely to do with national context. So they may be shaped by the order's relationship to the government. Some have stronger relationships, some have no relationship. That is shaped in part by who founded them, when, where, what activist organizations those people were coming out of. Also, of course, shaped by state policies. There are, for instance, sisters in Poland who don't have a relationship with the Polish state. It also depends on what the needs in their own communities are. To a certain extent, it depends on the broader culture's relationship to Catholicism as well. The sisters play well, I think play best often in places where Catholicism is familiar, but is not taken intensely seriously. Does that answer what you're asking? Thank you. Which part? That I think the sisters, and again, I defer to the sisters in the audience here, but my sense is that the sisters play the best, as in, they thrive the best in get the most positive reactions from the broader community, even if they have conservative opposition, in countries where Catholicism is familiar, so they're a little bit illegible, or they're legible differently. For instance, in Asian countries where there's not a lot of Catholic presence, they're still legible, but they're legible differently as, more closer, say, to kabuki theater in Japan. Or as, related to hijras or khwajasiras in South Asia. So they're differently legible, but not really legible as nuns. So they're most legible as nuns in places where Catholicism itself is relatively familiar, but also in places where the Catholicism is not taken intensely seriously. So unless something has changed, I believe there are still no sisters in Italy, for instance, or at least not houses. Yeah. So, it was interesting talking. There are sisters, or at least there were the last I knew, in Uruguay, and talking to some of the members of that house. I heard them say, there are a lot of other places in Latin America where people are kind of intense about their Catholicism, and the sisters wouldn't fly in the same way that they do in Uruguay. And that also has to do with questions of the state relationship to the Catholic Church, to the Vatican, I should say, specifically.
I just wanted to ask
Please.
a brief follow-up, since
Yeah.
we're on the global question right now. I noticed there was a house, at least at one point, in Odessa.
Yes.
And
I
I'm wondering
don't know what is
happening in Ukraine.
I don't know. I did have the opportunity to interview one of those sisters. The house was not long-lived, and those of us in the global north, global west sort of go automatically to, oh, well, it's Ukraine, and so maybe even maybe more before the war, people had this reaction, and thinking, oh, it's cultural conservatism, and there's a lot of Eastern Orthodox influence there. In fact, it had nothing to do with it being in Ukraine. That house fizzled for the same reason a number of houses fizzle when they're first started. They had a member who really considered the sisters to be their membership in the order to be their own personal grandstand. And so when it became about that person making it about themselves instead of the house being about a community. That's not entirely uncommon when houses are first getting off the ground, and it pretty much always is a death knell. So that's what happened in Ukraine long before the invasion. I have thought off and on about trying to reach back out to the former member of that house that I had the opportunity to interview, and I haven't had a chance to do that, but it's certainly put me in mind of my visit to Odessa.
Thank you. Other questions? Right here. Cody and then Fanny, okay?
Thank you so much for your talk. It's such an interesting case. And I was thinking along the lines of serious parody, that not everything that is worthy of one's critique is also worthy of one's emulation. So for the sisters, I'd be interested in hearing you flesh out more what, aside from the public service works, is worthy of emulation of the Catholic Church, theologically, institutionally. So you hit upon the emulation. I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, not the theology, not the institution. For the most part, again, they're nuns, they're sisters who are Catholic. And often they'll say, with some major differences from the Vatican. And sometimes they won't, some of them are, occasionally people are more conservative Catholics and also members of the order, and conservative evangelicals and also members of the order. I got into religious studies because it constantly makes me smack my forehead and go, what the? The roles of nuns. So you heard me say earlier, but I'll repeat it for folks that weren't there. I'm fond of joking that the sisters are the love children of Julie Andrews Maria in The Sound of Music and the drag queen Divine. If you think of kind of what the popular image of the nun is, kind of in US popular culture, not the ruler-wielding nun, not the sexualized nun, in fact, but the pious, supporting the community, engaging in education, fundraising, caring for the sick, caring for the poor, charity, and powerful political activism, as our audience member here also mentioned. It's worth saying, I looked briefly for this image and couldn't find it when I was putting the slideshow together, but Sister Soamai, formerly Sister Missionary Position, has lived for many, many years now in Tennessee, not long after the founding of the order, and has regularly engaged in protests against the School of the Americas. So has been side by side with Roman Catholic nuns, monks, and priests engaging in those kinds of protests. So that's another place where the sisters see the parallel. Yeah.
And then we'll go back here. Up here first, and then we'll go there. I think we have time for at least a couple more questions.
Thank you for all the questions, and I'm also more than happy to answer questions at the reception too, if you can stay.
Thank you so much for this fabulous talk. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the artistry of it. They look fabulous. You guys look fabulous. All the pictures are so beautiful and so constructed. And in the history of Catholic nuns, there's so much discussion about whether being adorned is appropriate. So like, as the bride of Christ, should you be beautiful or should you be modest? And especially in courtly love poems, for instance, the discussion of like the beautiful nun is such a complicated figure, and whether she puts on anything that's not just sackcloth, and what do you make of that? And so I'm curious how that fits into the artistry of the sisters, but also the parody element, which feels almost like it goes between those two questions.
That's an amazing question. Thank you. And I'm also thinking about the sort of erasure of gender difference that comes with the shaved head of other renunciant orders. In the context of the sisters, again, the reference to divine is really not an accident, because divine is very close to the founding of the sisters, and there are sisters that were both early members of the order and also members of the theater troupe that Divine was a part of for a period of time in San Francisco. So there's very, very close connections there. I kind of want to turn this to our friends in the back, but I won't put you on the spot. Please.
Iconography, Catholic paintings, things like that, we always expect these holy pictures to be, or be exhibited. And that helps, especially in the fabulousness of the gay community. I mean, which is who we're mostly ministering to and using in our ministry is the LGBTQ plus community. It was easier, it's easier to meld drag into that in order to touch more and who doesn't like looking pretty? Feeling pretty once in a while just brings joy. And playing with makeup brings joy because you can change yourself. And that's what it is. It's a transformative, I think it's a transformative element.
Thank you, that's amazing. And that's also something that I see in terms of the joy and also in terms of the legibility. And if you were to imagine queer nuns, I don't think it would be entirely surprising to imagine them in drag, to imagine them also in sequins and shiny things and what sometimes verges on glam makeup. Well, if you think about when they were founded, that also fits. Interestingly, so the image that I showed of the first manifestation, Sister Vish is in whiteface already at that point. The sisters did not, as a group, wear makeup at that point, or some of them it may have been like lipstick and things like that, but not the makeup that many people associate with the sisters today. That was most popularized by Sister Boom Boom when she ran for supervisor. Again, there was a poster there in the slideshow from that where it says "Surrender Diane." That would be Dianne Feinstein. But actually, Sister Vish has told me that she thinks she got the original idea of the whiteface from the movie Cabaret. So there's a whole other layer that's really interesting there about gender, because the MC in Cabaret is very interestingly gendered in terms of how it's written and how it's often played, references to, until the Nazis, Berlin was the place where some of the most progressive sexology was happening, where what today we call gender affirmation treatment was being pioneered. So yeah, there's another sort of interesting layer of history there, but in terms of what you have to say about the joy absolutely resonates with what I've heard other people say, and the beauty and bringing beauty and joy to people. There are still houses, especially in Australia, who manifest without makeup, and some sort of mixed houses where people manifest with or without, or occasionally manifest without, and the rest of the time with as well. Yeah, mish face.
Question here.
I'm like really loud, so do I need this?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Just in case we have anybody using assistive listening devices that pull off of the speakers.
Perhaps this speaks more to my ignorance about like the differentiation between like Irish Catholicism and Roman Catholicism and even like Eastern Orthodox traditions, but have you found that there's any like distinction of like reactions from these different like branches of Catholicism in your work?
Well, so just to clarify, Eastern Orthodoxy is different from Catholicism. It gets muddled and complicated when you have things like the Greek Orthodox Church, versus there are certain Orthodox churches that are actually under the Vatican. So there's the remnants of, not remnants, the ongoing presence of power struggles between those two major branches of Christianity. Roman Catholicism refers to the what was, when the split first happened centuries and centuries and centuries ago, what was called Western and Eastern Christianity. Roman Catholicism is what developed out of Western Christianity. Eventually, Protestantism splits off from that as one of the biggest major splits. Roman Catholicism is essentially Catholicism that follows the teachings of the Vatican. So most Irish Catholics are Roman Catholics. I know that's confusing. They live in Ireland, or their heritage is from Ireland, not from Italy, but that's where the language comes from. In terms of reactions, I would go back to what I was saying more about cultures that take their Catholicism more or less seriously, or that are stricter or less strict. I guess I want to be careful about, again, calling sort of conservative approaches to Catholicism serious. That goes against everything I've been trying to say here. But when we say take it seriously, I mean, like, you can't joke about it, right? I was saying in conversation earlier today that it seems like it's often the cultures that are willing to joke about priests and nuns are also willing to, are more willing to see the sisters as legible as nuns. I know that there have been attempts to launch houses in the Republic of Ireland. I don't know if any of them have been successful at this point. I'm looking in the back again. It didn't occur to me to go to the current list of worldwide orders to check on that, which was one of my touchstones when I was doing the research for the project. Yeah, oh yeah, in the UK for sure. Yeah, they were actually started by a missionary. That time I do have to put it in quotes because that's such a loaded term. They were started by a missionary from Australia. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, well, I think we will stop there. I want to encourage all of you to linger. We have a reception set up out there, and there'll be opportunity to talk more with Professor Wilcox there over drinks and appetizers and good fare. So I hope you can stay for that. But in the meantime, thank you so much. And
thank you.